Dr. Hutto received his PhD from UCLA and in bird ecology, and has been a researcher in the field for decades. Was one of the foundational researchers in this field. In fact, but was professor at University of Montana, founded the Avian Science Center at University of Montana, and has written a wonderful book called A Beautifully Burned Forest. I strongly recommend everyone check it out and give it a read. On a personal note, Dick and I grew up hiking in the same mountains, and got interested in mountains and forests in the same place, and unbeknownst to me at the time. But when I first started hiking around in Burn Forest and getting interested, and trying to find out what the science had to tell me about it, I found Dick's 1995 study, which was one of the key studies on the issue. And it's what got me interested and led me back to graduate school to get my PhD in this field. Um, there are very few scientists who I can honestly say have had a truly tectonic foundational influence on a field. Dr. Hutto is certainly one of those scientists, and I would put him at the very top of that list in terms of not just avian ecology, but in terms of understanding the biodiversity of post-fire habitats, especially post-fire habitats created by severely burned forests and the tremendous ecological richness in those areas. So without further ado, I introduce Dr. Hutto.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chad. That's very kind of you. Yeah, I remember when Chad came and visited the University of Montana right before you started grad school, full of questions. Had you been through law school or something? Anyway, then he ran away and entered grad school and didn't look back after that, and working on fire and forest issues. So I'm grateful to CR Club and to Jennifer for the invitation. So this is the book that Chad referred to, A Beautifully Burned Forest. And most of you would look at a title like that and go, "What an idiot!" You know, he's got an oxymoron in the title. I mean, beautifully burned forest. Then I would ask, well, why do most of you think it's not beautiful? You know, a beautiful thing. And the reason is you've been brainwashed since you were little kids, right? I mean, this is what we grew up on. This shameful waste weakens America. And on the right, there are two little clips out of the real Smokey Bear comic book that I had as a kid. Smokey tells him how he hates forest fires, how they destroy his animal friends. And now, the modern day version of the same thing is like this. You can drive down the street and see these sorts of things. The Forest Service. What do you want? This, the green on the left, or this, the black on the right? Or down below. Unfortunately, they can't run for their lives. These are trees that burned up that incidentally depend on severe fire like that for their reproductive success. But anyway, this is the kind of thing that you see. And all this has sort of morphed a bit recently, in that now what we hear is not all fires are bad. You know, historically, come on, there was low severity understory fire, and everything was great, and we were all happy. But the problem is we have too much fire suppression, allowed our little forest to get overgrown, and now when a fire burns, you see the bottom middle, it's oh my God, now we're back to smoky again, right? And so currently we have a high severity crown fire regime because of too much fire suppression. Well, the research data show that for most forest types in the West, suppression had very little effect. The lowest elevations, yes, indeed, but not most of our forests. And so luckily, we have a new thing to think about: climate change. Oh, okay. Well, they're not overgrown, but they're getting dry. So now when the forest burns, we have the same thing. Here comes a severe fire down there, and so it's bad, right? Up above historical, good. This is bad. This has led to the good, bad fire public messaging system. This is the USDA. Look at down the bottom there. Forest Service, Nature Conservancy. This is an organization about the conservation of nature, and they're on board with this. So on the left we have a good fire here, and on the right with all the flames, that's a bad fire. And so what I want to do is tell you, first of all, I'm going to talk about this idea with respect to mixed conifer forests in the West. That's the green shows that. The more mesic mixed conifer are a little bit to the north, basically, but it's a U-shaped thing, and it's most of the mixed conifer forests of the West. 85% are in the sort of mesic range. So we're talking about 85% of the mixed conifer forests in the West. Historically, what's really going on with all of those, when mixed conifer forests burn, they tend to burn relatively severely. And historically, that was probably the normal fire regime. And so that's not what we're hearing, right? So how do I know this? Well, I walk out into these places, right? And here's what you see. You see a beautiful view with black. I mean, it's artistic. You hear sounds you've never heard, smells you've never smelled, and you see a profusion of flowers everywhere. Severely burned forests are magical because many species seem to appear out of nowhere. The richness of bird life is astounding. Here's a little video I took off my iPhone, right? Let's see if you can hear anything. Pileated woodpecker there. Hairy woodpecker flies in.
Pileated there. This.
Here, three-toed.
Oh, three-toed. Three-toed, northern tree-toed. Hairy woodpecker there.
This is just standing in one place with my iPhone, right?
And
Right near Missoula a couple of years ago when we had a fire near town.
Another hairy woodpecker. Hairy woodpecker there.
So you get the idea. I mean, you can see three woodpeckers in the middle there of this slide. One, two, three, and a fourth will fly in down here. Four.
Three toads.
I mean, it's crazy. And it's not just woodpeckers. Come on, robins. Nowhere are robins more abundant than in severely burned forests. You know, great gray owls come in. Hummingbirds do weirdo displays and act like grouse. Clark's nutcracker come in like this picture of, they'll harvest ponderosa pine seeds. They're not just strictly tied to the highest elevation firs, and you can get bluebirds. Nowhere are bluebirds more abundant than in severely burned forests. Here's a boreal toad up on top here. They closed the North Fork Road in Glacier National Park because so many boreal toads were walking into severely burned forests there one year. Lazuli bunting. Anyway, you get the idea. The diversity of things in these severely burned forests is astounding. Well, now you might be saying to yourself, so what? Good grief. I can see a variety of species in a garbage dump. That doesn't make a garbage dump, really special and worthy of conservation attention and all that. Well, here's the deal. A lot of these species occur rarely outside burned forests. And the champion is the one I had on the cover of the book, the blackback woodpecker. It's one species that occurs almost entirely within recently burned forest conditions. In reference to blackbacks, way back 100 years ago, Manly Hardy wrote Major Bendire that specimens were so abundant in fire-killed timber areas, I once shot the heads off six in a few minutes when I was short of material for stew. I mean, people have known about this, right? But haven't kind of connected the dots. Here are our data from doing bird survey work in the Northern Rockies. This is data from over 20,000 survey points in 20 or 30 different vegetation types. And basically, for all intents and purposes, the only place you find a blackback is in a burned forest, rarely outside of that. And the places they occur tend to be relatively intact, densely stalked, mature, thick-barked conifers, Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, western larch, that kind of thing, the thick bark trees. So you got to have all these ingredients, then you have the magic. Here's another video.
Oh, this is the hero of our story, male blackback woodpecker. Jet black on the back with a brilliant yellow cap on top of his head.
One cool bird, that blackback. So not only have they evolved a behavior to select, a narrow kind of vegetation type they occur in, but they've also evolved cryptic coloration. Here's the blackback on the left. Look at it against a black tree. Is that any less impressive to you than this white ptarmigan in the snow? And does it reflect any less of an evolutionary history? No. They're very, very specialized to occur in these severely burned forest conditions. And they aren't alone. There are other species that occur almost entirely within recently burned forests, including this little jewel beetle. This thing has also evolved special trait. An infrared sensor on its thorax can detect heat for up to 50, it said, 50 miles away. So they detect heat of the severely burning trees. They're still smoldering. They come in, lay their eggs on the trees. The trees are dead, so they're now defenseless. And the larvae of these beetles start digging in the good wood beneath the charcoal bark. And that's why the woodpeckers are coming in. You've ever heard one of these beetles, in a tree? Here they are eating. This is walking up to a tree, with a microphone right there, who's standing next to the tree, and that's the beetle chewing underneath. How about the fire morel mushroom that you have on your salad at night? Well, come on. It occurs almost entirely within severely burned forest conditions. And things like the morel mushroom and the blackback, the more severely burned, low, medium, high, the higher the probability of occurrence. Mushroom, low proportion of plots severely burned, high proportion, high probability of occurrence. This came out of Andrew Larson and others study in rimfire there near you guys. So in short, mixed conifer forests are transformed by severe fire. They're not destroyed by severe fire. They're very, very special. The lesson is that severely burned forests are unique, and the historical fire regime associated with most mixed conifer forests in the West is not one dominated by low severity understory fire, but it's one dominated by healthy doses of severe crown fire. So now when we look at this good fire, bad fire message, right, you have to really start thinking. We need to educate people about the story I just told you about, all the plants and animals that are nearly restricted to this particular condition. And we also need to educate people about ecology. So we'll change the narrative by telling people how ecologically unique burn forests are, and by reminding people that disturbance is a natural ecological process. It's part of our mixed conifer forest system. So all kinds of disturbance, from volcanic eruptions to blowdowns to fire to hurricanes. This is all disturbance, and anyone who's taken Ecology 101 knows disturbance is a natural process that triggers what's called succession. Succession is a series of vegetation types that go from recently disturbed to slightly older, to older still, to older still, to all the way up to old growth. Wait 3, 4, 5, 600 years, you get the old growth. But all stages are important, and they all harbor completely unique animal and plant species. So you got to have all those stages to maintain the integrity of the mixed conifer forest system. And notice that it's severe fire causes succession. Understory burning leaves the forest in a steady state, right? So people celebrate this and say, wow, if we just had low severity fire in the understory, the forest would be okay. Well, yeah, but you're not going to get succession, so you just missed out on 90% of the interesting variety of life on Earth. So we need to begin thinking of succession in a circular fashion, not this straight thing. The straight line indicates you're going to an end point, and that's the end all be all and the most important thing. No, every stage is important. And so when you get to young or mature forests or older forests, sooner or later, severe fire is going to come. Then you get your black and standing dead forest, then your snag forest later on, then your shrub land with snags later on, if the forest is intact. If you deviate from a nice mature forest and from fire, you can get other kinds of succession. If you clear cut, you'll get succession. If you prescribe fire, you might get succession if there's enough fire. Thinning, you get fire. Beetle kill, you get fire. Beetle kill, you get succession. Blowdown, you get succession. But none of those paths of succession are like this one on the outside, which gives you absolutely unique animal and plant species. So the only way to get all the parts of the system is to have a real successional pathway, which involves severe fire. So severely burned forest conditions are therefore not only historically natural, but are a necessary part of mixed conifer forest systems. So now when we see a fire burn and a big black scar up on the hill, you don't call it a big black scar, you call it a beauty mark. All right, so there's the story. Now we have to consider 3 questions. Does our land management, do our current practices serve to maintain the ecological integrity of our disturbance-dependent forests? So I told you all of what's unique about these forests. So let's just consider, what do we do before fire? What do we do during fire? And what do we do after fire? And then think about, whether we're acting to maintain the integrity of a disturbance-dependent forest system. So before fire, here's what we do. Now, these days, we do what's called ecologically managed forest. Go through, thin, get an understory burn, and yay, everything's good, right? Over here, fire suppressed forest. Oh, that's back to smoky. Bad, 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 bad. The problem, and this is in publications, right? Professional publications. And the problem is, this is the ecologically managed forest on the left. This is the one on the back right is ecologically mismanaged, essentially. It's not natural. Our mixed conifer forests, this is not a natural sort of system. And you can find it in other publications. Here's another one from Stevens at Berkeley and others. They show the same thing. You take this path to the left, thin out the forest, you get a little burn. There's a blackback there, which is not right. And then you go this side and the thing burns up because it hasn't been harvested or whatever and thinned. And now you get, fish dying and water and death and runoff. And when in fact, that's not what happens. I just showed you what happens. It's magical this side. So we're getting kind of the wrong story here, the good fire, bad fire story. The other thing that's interesting is if we go back here, if we do this thinning and then burning, you don't get these blackbacks in there. So if you thin a forest up here on the left and then it burns severely, which it will, because severe fires are dictated by the weather, not by anything else. So when you have hot, dry, windy conditions, they're going to burn these forests. But you don't get all these blackbacks and other things, bluebirds and things, like I said, because it's not, remember, you have to have dense, standing dead timber, hundreds of trees per acre to get the magic. So we're, in a sense, ruining the situation a bit before by saying it needs to be thin. That's not true. And then we wreck it after disturbance event because you don't get all the cool, magical things that can happen. It's too thinned out. So any deviation from the real succession on the outside here is going to be a problem because you're going to miss all the magic species that occur with all those stages. So the solution for pre-fire timber harvesting is, because it short circuits natural succession, it should always be conducted in moderation. That's sort of my solution. Public lands, come on, they can provide a bit of timber, big deal, but never, ever, ever outside of moderation. They can't be treated like commercial timberlands. The second thing, activity during fire. Now, what do we do during fire? We suppress it. So we go out and with, anything that starts, we want to jump on it by 10 a.m. the next morning. And we've been we've been trained to think that we need to do this because it's bad, right? Severe fire is bad, 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 bad. And so maybe that's a good thing. If we get people to think it's bad, at least we'll stop these fires and extinguish them before they get large, right? But no, we don't. Suppression does not prevent big fires from happening. There's amazing data out of Canada, Ontario, half the province where fire suppression occurred, half where it didn't. And where you suppress fires, you get a ton of tiny fires, all these tiny tire fires. It's really successful. We put out 98% of the fires, right? But did we reduce the number of huge fires? No, not at all. No statistical difference in the number of huge fires between suppressed and unsuppressed areas. Why? Because weather is what determines those big fires. It doesn't matter whether you thin the forest or not. So, or try to suppress fires or not. They're going to burn. So large, severe fires are inevitable. And fire suppression doesn't put a dent in the number of large fires that burn, the really large ones. Also, large fires don't pose the kind of safety risk that we assume exists. So data out of the research lab here in Missoula, the fire lab by Jack Cohn, shows you can have a house like this cabin here he had with a 250-foot wall of flame 40 feet from this house, and the house is perfectly fine. There's a lot of things we can do to harden homes and be relatively safe, and then learn to celebrate these severe fire events without dying. So the solution to to fire suppression, just like the solution to the timber harvesting. Just relax a bit, with our efforts. We don't have to be so aggressive with timber harvesting or so aggressive with fire suppression. The last thing then, after fire, that's salvage logging. And this is 100% negative. Every study ever conducted on salvage logging that has looked at ecology after salvage logging has shown negative effects. I once wrote, I'm hard pressed to find any example in wildlife biology where the effect of a particular land use is as close to 100% negative as the typical post-fire salvage logging operation tends to be. It's bad. You know why. You can't take the trees and have things that depend on trees to be there. You're not going to get the beetles. You're not going to get the birds. You're not going to get the bluebirds. You're not going to get the blackbacks. So the solution is make burn forests the last, not the first place you go to get timber, because they harbor special ecological value. And it's interesting that not only do we make it the first place we go, we have environmental all the regulations waived and expedition and good grief, it's crazy. This should be out of just not allowed at all. So despite the facts I presented here, every scoping document Forest Service puts out that I've seen stresses the need to recover economic value. When a forest burns up, come on, we lost some economic value there. I got to help the local community. But I would say you can help the local community if you lost a little of your timber base there. Well, go somewhere else and get a few trees. It's not that big a deal. Why are you going into the burn forest to get those? That's 10 times more special than just a regular old green tree forest. Not only that, there's a lot of other ways to help the local economy if you want to. Why not facilitate potentially significant recreation and ecotourism booms that could happen if you just bring people in? They could fill restaurants and hotels and have nature tourism business be booming for years after a fire. It's amazing to go into these places. So when a severe fire burns, we really need to be in the streets, dancing in the streets, celebrating, because you're not going to see anything like what occurs in a burn forest outside of when it's burned severely. We have to begin getting away from the boogeyman of Smokey Bear and begin to appreciate the ecological uniqueness in severely burned forests. And that's why the title is not an oxymoron. Burned forests really are beautiful if everything is intact and everybody's safe.
In my research over the past 25 years, and in all of my investigations of the research that many, many other scientists, literally hundreds at this point, have done over the past couple of decades, looking into this issue, what I've found is that there's a very strong pattern of evidence indicating that the two most ecologically important but most biodiverse forest habitat types are old growth forest and dense, mature, and old growth forest that burns at high intensity, where most or all the trees are killed, where it's what we call complex early seral forest, or sometimes I call it snag forest habitat. That's where you get your peaks of biodiversity, of wildlife abundance. And in most data sets, the one that's actually the highest is the severely burned forest. These areas are ecological treasures. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. I echo what you're saying, Chad. I remember when I first went out into some of these burned forests, and the number of bluebirds was amazing in year one, right? Mountain bluebird. And how are there so many in the first years? It hasn't even been a year. Woodpeckers aren't even in there digging nests. Well, the reason there were so many in most of the places I went were there were plenty of snags already existing. And that got me thinking, oh my God, the mountain bluebird is an old growth dependent species. No one's ever seen one in an old growth, but they're old growth dependent because the old growth has developed the conditions that are needed by some of these early post-fire species that just show up and go berserk. So everything's connected. You need all these stages intact to have all the species that occupy each of the different stages, which is pretty cool.
If they do thinning and the fire doesn't really burn as much as it could, then let's say you compare a forest later on that had burned and one that had not burned so much. What is different about it? Is it like one's less biodiverse than the other, or Do you see what I mean? Immediately after, there's a lot of diversity, but what about
Yep.
down the road?
Yeah, Ray, good question. Really good. Nobody's looked at that carefully. Okay, we had data, and Chad and others know that you can go a little longer, like let's go 10 to 20 years, and some real magic happens then too. That's where things like Lewis's woodpecker, house wren goes through the roof, white-breasted nuthatch, Williamson sapsucker. So yeah, there's brand new things that come in around age 10. But when you go beyond that, there's not a lot of data out there. People haven't looked at 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old forests with standing dead versus those without the standing dead. But they're still standing dead 20, 30, 40 years later. And I don't know how important that is. But certainly for many years, easily I'd say in up to 40 years, very unique. The burned one versus any other kind of early successional forest. And in the first paper I published, I just did clear cuts versus burn forests, and that was like night and day. That wasn't even close. They're totally different. Any thoughts about how to deal with community water sources? It seems like most people agree in canyons and things where community water supplies exist that we can do things to try to make sure the water stays pure and that kind of thing. That could be a good place to do thinning and that kind of thing. I don't know. Uh, so yeah, it's probably you need to do something special and different in those canyons. Push or thin along waterways because those are sensitive too. And you want the dead and down material in waterways after a severe disturbance event. So like that professional publication that had the severe burn and then all the runoff and fish dying and stuff. Well, actually, fisheries are never better than after a severe burn and runoff, and you get siltation and reorganization of streams, and magic happens in those streams too. You have to read the fisheries literature to get that information, but it's important. How do we make this clear to Board of Natural Resources legislators? They don't seem to be listening. Sally, good question. If I had an answer, I could quit. We've been trying this, Chad and I, certainly, and others for 30 years, and it's hard to know why people don't want to listen. I like to rely on the woodpecker and the bluebirds and things because they're talking, and people tend to listen. Let the mushrooms talk, and people will listen. Do you have any talking points when trying to make this point to fire authorities who vote for these types of wildfire prevention practices? Just the talking points that are in here that could be cut and pasted. Yeah, but the whole fire, there's a whole industry, and it's really tough to change our practices and get out of this put out every fire sort of mentality. But I think we're moving the right way, in the right direction. I mean, people are talking more and more about, managing wildfire in the outback, letting it go, and that's probably the best role for things farther away from communities and roadless areas and all that. Let them burn. They're not going anywhere most of the time. The data were there. Look at that paper from Ontario. It's unbelievable. And most fires don't go more than a few hundred acres. Okay, Jennifer, about the story, mega fires burn hot enough to sterilize the soil. Oh yeah. There were a couple. It's pretty rare those spots. I went through Yellowstone after the '88 fires, and yeah, there was some toast in there. There were some places that were like nothing. Yeah, but pretty rare. Pretty rare to get that sort of thing. What industry doesn't want big wildfires, and why? Who are the winners and losers about fire? We have a fire industrial complex that likes fire and is built around fire. People flying planes and going in and that's where all the Forest Service employees are now, firefighting. So there's some interest in wanting to fight fire, even though, I really wonder the extent to which we need to be doing that. And notice that when communities burn down, if the places are prepared, it's not as risky as we think. The bad stuff is what happens like in LA, with Palisades and, 1,600-mile-an-hour winds. I'm sorry. There's nothing we can do when that happens. Embers are going to be blowing from who knows where. But anyway, what industry doesn't want big wildfires? I'm not sure. low intensity burns for enhanced biodiversity. Interesting. I think a lot about this, but my gut feeling is indigenous burning practices were appropriate for where they lived and right around settlement areas and were very localized, according to Bill Baker and others who got statistics and wrote about this he wrote about this in his book. So it's very localized. It wasn't throughout the West, A. B, as I tried to point out in this talk, low severity understory burning is not the natural fire regime for most of the mixed conifer forest systems that we live in. Way, way down the low elevation, open ponderosa pine, okay, perhaps. But most places, no. And so the indigenous burning was utilitarian by and large. They're going to drive game. They're going to produce foods they need, plants for baskets, things. That's utilitarian. It's not ecosystem management that they were worried about. So that's my take on the indigenous burning. But everyone has shifted toward that now, right? And if you say, well, wait a minute, I don't know about this, then you're kind of accused of, being a racist, you know, and it's like, it's very frustrating. But my take is that, the indigenous burning is really utilitarian, and it's not restoration or anything like that. So people want you to think understory burning is restoration, and I'm trying to say, show me the things that are out of whack. They're not. You're going to go down in low elevation or down to Arizona or New Mexico before you're going to convince me that things are kind of out of whack. Once you get in where that whole map I showed you, up through the Sierras, through the middle to the northern Sierras, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, down into Wyoming, I don't believe it. We're not out of whack at all. We're well within the historic range of natural variation. We don't need to be out there for that. If you want to justify cutting some wood in the forest as part of the multiple use of the public forest system, fine. Say that. Don't tell me you're restoring the forest. You're not. This restoration thing is driving me crazy.
Having read A Beautifully Burned Forest, I can tell you it's a beautifully written book.
Oh, thank
Sort of part memoir, part scientific exploration, part just sort of this wonderful expression of joy about what's happening in, the beauty, the miracle of what's happening in burned forest. So I highly recommend it. In the book, you talk about the peak call of the blackback woodpecker and how to make it. And I tried, and nothing came out that was worthy of anything. So can you replicate it? And
that's the best I could do right there. So it's sort of a drawn out peak with whistling at the same time.
Okay.
I mean, that all those woodpeckers are subtly different, and I used to be a lot better. Now I can't hear as well. It's like, but Downey's different than Harry's, different than Flicker. They all have their little and the drumming patterns are distinct. So did you hear the sound when I played those videos?
Yeah.
Okay, so there was a three-toed that drummed in that one with the iPhone, and they speed up at the end. So it's like, whereas Downey and Harry are very even. They don't speed up. Okay, so that's how you distinguish most of the woodpeckers, which are even, with the three-toed, northern three-toed, American three-toed, and the blackback. They speed up at the end, and they're sort of very sharp pounding. The pileated speeds up at the end too, but it's very powerful and sounds like a diving board. Bum, 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 kind of a thing. So it's another category. It's like, whoa, watch out, this pileated is coming. Whereas the little blackback and the three-toads are much more delicate, but they do speed up. So that's how I can tell it's one of those. It's hard to tell those two apart, or at least for me.
Yeah, well, it sounds like for you it's as much about the sights in the forest as the sounds of the forest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The sounds, the sights, the smells.
Yeah.
It's just a weird place to walk through. It's just magic.
Well, if the woodpeckers ever come back to the redwood tree that's just off my deck, I'll definitely be paying more attention.
Yeah. And it's like, I'm not sure what happened, Chad. I have to, with the redwoods that burned, the sequoias. Is there any bird activity that happened there too?
Oh God, yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah, and
Huh.
if you haven't seen them, we just published two new papers on giant sequoia regeneration and the
Yeah,
high
I did see one of
and
them. Yeah.
yeah, I'll send you. There's a second one too, and we're finding the most by far the most spectacular giant sequoia regeneration in the high intensity
Right.
fire patches.
Right.
We do find regeneration of sequoias in the low and moderate, but the problem is after several years, it almost all dies in almost all locations. Whereas in the high intensity fire patches, that's where you get the natural succession. And not only that, we're finding Pacific fishers foraging and denning in the high intensity fire patches in the sequoia groves. We're finding spotted owls
Huh.
nesting and foraging. We're finding enormous diversity and abundance of shrub nesting birds. The wood warblers are going crazy in the whitethorn and the deer brush. And
Huh.
it's just it's wonderful. It's like everything that you see in every other complex early seral forest, except maybe and then some.
Huh.
It's really extraordinary. Anyway,
Huh.
if you want to come
Yeah.
out, by the way, Dick, and hike
Yeah.
around in the sequoia generation,
Yeah.
and see some of the stuff going on in there, let me know. I'd be
Yeah.
happy to do it.
Right. Yeah, I get it makes you think of even a system like that system where people always say it's a low severity understory, regime. Understory regimes, low severity understory regimes most always have a high severity component, but that's infrequent. So you have the frequent low severity, infrequent high severity. By infrequent, that means like every 3, 4, 500 years. Hey, in our lifetime, we're just not going to see it,
Yeah.
and we don't appreciate that what happened there in that sequoia grove was mad. You were lucky to have lived
Oh,
at the time when that
absolutely,
restoration
absolutely.
event occurred.
Yeah,
Right.
and
That's
people aren't wrong that low and moderate intensity fire is natural in giant sequoia groves. Of course, it's natural, but it's also natural on these longer intervals to have these high intensity fire
right.
patches, including big ones. And the thing that I think people are missing is that's the only time that you
Right.
really get effective reproduction is in
Yeah.
those 300 or 400 year cycles of high intensity fire. You do not get effective reproduction with lower intensity fire.
Right.
It seems like it for a couple of years, and people walk away. They don't come back and gather data. We're doing
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's almost all dead.
That's pretty neat. Wow. Yeah. And of course, now we do have the climate issue, and reproduction is not that great for trees anywhere, basically. But that's a climate problem. We're not going to solve that unless we deal with a climate problem. Um, so,
Yeah, well, the one place where reproduction is off the charts is in these high intensity fire patches in the sequoia groves. We just found an average of 8,000 sequoia seedlings and saplings per acre at 4 years post fire. They're so dense it's hard to walk through them without
yeah,
worrying
yeah,
about stepping on some.
yeah, that's neat. Wow. I have to see that.
You debunk the the whole narrative of overgrown forest from a century of fire suppression. You debunked
Hmm.
that, and to a great extent, although you did say it was the fire suppression was actually relatively successful after World War II.
In the lowest elevation forest types, the open
Okay,
grown ponderosa, I think there's
uh,
there's pretty good evidence that we were successful and that understory began growing up unnaturally. But that's small, that's less than 15% of all Western conifer forests. It's not that much.
okay. Well, so but within the context of those forests, um, was fire suppression successful enough that you didn't get enough burned forest to support some of these bird species? Like, is there any correlation with any decline in bird species relative to fire suppression and sort of taking away the habitat that they rely on?
Not that I'm aware of. I
Okay,
have to look at some of those publications out of Arizona. Nothing crazy.
okay,
Not like, oh my gosh, there goes the flammulated owl. No, not
okay,
that I know of.
okay, great, great.
Yeah.
And you talk about the kind of how to evaluate fire regimes and some of the problems with how fire regimes are sort of stated
Determined.
and
Yeah.
determined. And Could you talk? I mean, it's a really interesting part of the book that, was for me important. Sometimes,
Yeah.
sometimes, sometimes it's like for my pea brain getting the science,
Yeah.
of evaluating evaluating
Yeah.
the research. But you did note how using an average fire regime
Mm-hmm. So
could
we,
be so misleading.
people want to find out what the regime is because that's what we should be managing for. And because that's the natural sort of system. And traditionally, people have approached it through tree ring, coring. So you core trees, you get the tree ring record, fire scars, you can see when fires occurred, and you tally all this stuff up, and this is where people come up with these statistics that, oh wow, this stand burned every 6 years or every 12 years on average or whatever. Um, the there's a couple of problems. One is, unless you're really lucky, you don't go back more than a few hundred years. If you're lucky, you can get back there 4, 5, 6, 700 years or something like that. But it's still relatively restricted, and so the picture you're going to get is going to be heavily influenced by the humans because we've been around doing pretty heavy stuff for the last 100 years or 200 years. So that's one of the problems. The other problem is when you do these studies, you have a study site and then you core a tree and you get another tree. And the first one said, oh, it burned in 1910. The second tree said it burned in 1920. But the first one doesn't have the 20 record and the second one doesn't have the 10 record. So you just put them together and say, well, there must have been a fire in both years. And so all of a sudden you're adding up a lot of fires in your record by putting all your data together. And it makes it look like things are much more frequent than maybe they really were, or much more restricted spatially than they really were, much more patchy. So it's a tough thing to do. The people that are good at it, sweating them and others, they know what they're doing, and they're probably getting a pretty accurate picture back, a few hundred years or more. What my argument is with the book is, I think we can go back farther in time with looking at adaptations of animals and plants. So if they carry characteristics like an infrared detector, or a black back or whatever, that didn't come in 2 or 3 years. That took thousands of years. And so now I'm going back thousands of years saying, hey, this thing evolved with this particular system. This system must have been around. And so it's just another way to get at, what occurred in the past? What's natural? What do all the things that we see in the forest today need in order to be successful? And so that's how I look at that. The other thing is you can go into lake cores and things to go really back in deep time, thousands of years. And a lot of people have been doing this, and all of them show records of severe fire again and again and again. There's no single place that is a place or a target. And that's the kind of papers that generally get written. Oh, there is no one target. It's always dynamic. Well, that's my point too. That's why I draw that circle. It's always changing, always dynamic. There isn't one point to go to manage for. What we need to manage for is a system and a dynamic system that consists of severe events and some
So,
not so severe.
so in other words, what we're using more often than not is data from when we as humans were able to record the data.
Yeah.
And everything that happened, prior to the development of human activities
is hard to find, right?
you have to look at it incredibly differently. But the fact that we're using what we've been able to document where we're impacting it is overused.
I think.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And the other thing is when the people that do tree ring studies do it where you can get tree ring records out of fire scars on trees. Well, where's that? Not in places that burn severely. So you can't even get data out of most forests, right? So that's why it tends to be the lowest elevation, open grown ponderosa and sequoias, maybe things that scar, where there's frequent understory burning and rescarring or injuring the same spot over and over again. But you're missing a lot of forest types that don't scar like that. And they tend to be the more severe, less frequent burn system. especially as you go up in elevation, past lodgepole, spruce, fir, that kind of thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Nobody seems to argue that that's a severe fire dependent system. It's this mixed conifer zone right above the pea pine where I think there's most controversy.
And when the term average fire intensity is used, can you explain how what you have to read into that kind of average?
Yeah, for when you get the tree rings, you mean?
Well, I talk about an average fire regime being
Yeah.
12 years or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
That,
It's an average. So
right.
if I took a tree ring and saw a fire, in year 0 and 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, it would be an average of 10 years. Every 10 years, I have a fire. Okay, now I could give you another set of numbers, 0 to 38, 79, and whatever, and give you the same average. Now, if you don't show me the standard deviation, I don't know that there aren't long periods without fire. And so the managers tend to say, we need to, it's every 6 years, burn, burn. Wait, 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 wait. That's the average. Any of these tree ring things may show 50, 60, 70 years without a fire, even though your average might be 12. So you need to look at the standard deviation with these data, not just the average, but the average seems to be what everyone writes about.
Well, and I think that's an important
Yeah.
distinction, because it really does change your thoughts about what you're,
Yeah.
yeah. So I
Right. And so, yeah, I said in the book, I went out in the field with someone here in Missoula that said, oh, this place burned on average every 12 years and it hasn't burned for 20. So it's missed 4 cycles or something.
Yeah.
What do you mean it's missed 4 cycles? Maybe it's just in this period where it's unburned for 40 years. Show me the data. Show me not just the mean. Let's look at the standard deviation. Maybe having a 40-year period without a fire is not all that unusual.
And do you think that with the degree of salvage logging going on, that it is going to spell real disaster for certain bird species who are being deprived?
No, probably not because there's so much force it's going to burn when we even touch it. However, I just think it's more a philosophical thing of beginning to appreciate all the stages of succession and the processes we need to maintain. By law, we're required by the National Forest Management Act and others to maintain a system that sustains us all. That's the overarching umbrella. We can do a lot of things, we can have multiple use, but never, ever, ever if it compromises the integrity of the system that sustains us. And so we need to understand, what's the big system here that we're supposed to be trying to sustain and then operate within that to do little things that we want to do. Take our ATV out or fish or hike or harvest a tree or whatever. We can do a lot of things, but don't compromise the integrity of the system when you're doing it. That's what the law says, and that's what we're morally obligated to do. So whether if the law disappears, which it probably will, hopefully not soon, but that National Forest Management Act is a good one.
Okay. And could you finally just talk a little bit about your experience of taking school kids out into burnt forests? I just love the idea of doing that.
So we had a fire. It was one of these things I was saying, wow, you're really lucky in your lifetime if you have a severe fire nearby. Well, Missoula had one in 2003, only like 5 miles from me here, right here. And so when that happened, oh my God, I was like in heaven. And my wife works for the Forest Service. She's an interpretive biologist, and she's responsible for doing things like education with school kids and stuff. And so, we were both pushing really hard with the district ranger and forest supervisor and others, like, don't touch the forest, leave it alone. This is going to be amazing. This will be the most amazing thing, and they left it alone. And it was amazing. I mean, I had 15 years of data there just driving, 5 minutes away. It was amazing. And then we bused in school buses over 4,000 kids to that place and talked about, and my wife rewrote the whole interpretive trail at one end that was written for something else. She rewrote it all for about fire, and people could stop and look at all the different things and learn. After 10 years, everything peters out, but hey, we got a good 10 years out of it. And people from town, commented on how much they enjoyed going out and and learning about their backyard, basically. So I keep hoping every year is going to be another good fire year, but people all look at me and go, if there's a severe fire, we better look and see if Hutto's out
Yes.
there.
Be careful what you wish for.
Right, right.
Make sure your own home isn't really harmed
Right,
against fire. Yes. Your book, as well as Chad's Smokescreen.
Yeah, smoke
Really,
screen's great.
you did so much for me in terms of looking at post-fire forests so differently. And for that, I thank you both. And
Yeah.
I thank you, Chad, for being here today to introduce your good friend. And do you have any final comments you want to make?
No, thanks. So that's very gracious. I appreciate that, and big thanks to you, Dick, for coming and speaking to all of us, and thanks to thanks to the Sierra Club for organizing this. This is this is a really important forum for these kinds of discussions.
Yeah, great. Yeah, same things. Thanks to the
Okay.
Sierra Club.